Wicked Tiger.
With the Takom Tiger built and painted, it was now time to show you the steps I took to weather and present this unique camouflage scheme of the 102nd Panzer Division. I have to confess I was a little frozen with indecision with how to progress with this one due to that unique colour scheme, but I find the best tactic is to just do something. Motion creates momentum, and usually the next step tends to present itself, and so on. So I started by looking at the stowage items that came with the kit. There are two identical unditching beams supplied in the kit, so I'd only thought about using one so they didn't look too symmetrical. The grain texture is enhanced by running the edge of a razor saw across the part. The part can then be lightly sanded to remove any of that frayed discarded material. The resulting texture should pop once the part is painted and weathered. However, as you can see, that small technique makes quite a big difference to that part. But to let you in on a little secret, I ended up not using the part after all, but wanted to share that technique with you. I wasn't sure how much of the stowage I was going to use on the model, but what I had was prepared for painting and given a quick paint job using the Atom paints through my airbrush. I did like the look of the spare wheels with that tarp draped over them, so I went about detail painting that part. I try to approach painting the stowage like I would figures, so I start with the darkest or the shadow colour as my base layer, and then I build my highlights up using lightened tones of that base colour. By using acrylics and thinning them with water, I'm able to create transparent glazes that will help me in creating an even transition from the dark to light. By making multiple passes with the colour, I'm increasing the opacity of that colour and giving me the lightened tones I'm after. So with that sniff of momentum, I decided to jump in headfirst to the weathering. You may recall I'd built the model so I would be able to remove the track and wheel sections, and the next stages will show you why that capability was important. Pigment powders are very messy and I have a real love-hate relationship with them, but they deliver a natural, grainy texture that is hard to produce any other way. They do, however, need something to bind them to the model, and that is where the VMS Alkyd binder comes into play. The binding agent and the pigments are mixed into a paste and applied to the recessed areas that are sitting in behind where the wheels will eventually be. The pigments present one way when wet, but can often look completely different when dry, so this stage was a bit of a leap of faith and a little bit of an experiment for me. I was heavy-handed with the application, however I was able to create interesting textures in the pigment paste by using a tissue to remove and stipple the paste over the surfaces of the model. The VMS binder is a slow drying binder which allows me to manipulate and blend it using a white spirit. What that means is if I've applied too much of that paste, I'm able to blend it and remove it using a brush and the white spirit, or even a cotton bud to take it off. It's important to remember that most of these areas will be hidden behind wheels, so by exaggerating the effects in these areas, they should be easier to see on the finished model. Fitting the decals was the next logical step before the weathering could begin. The model was sprayed in a coat of high gloss varnish straight from the rattle can in preparation. The deep recesses through the moulded zimmerit pattern had the potential to cause issues with the decals. The high gloss finish will provide me with the best foundation to apply them and should help with issues such as silvering. I made sure the varnish had 24 hours to cure properly so the application fluids wouldn't taint the paint. A generous coverage of Mr. Mark's setting solution was first applied, and this will help soften and relax that decal through the mouldings. The decal can then be slid into place. I can fine-tune that positioning somewhat, however getting the decal as close to its finished position as possible is what I'm hoping for at this stage. Once in place, a generous amount of the decal softener was applied over the face of the decal. The softener just does what it says. It softens the decal and allows it to sit more easily through the recesses and the shapes of that model. After a minute or two, I can then work the decal through the contours of that part using the tip of a cotton bud. The same techniques were used on the turret stowage bin, and as you can see, it worked flawlessly. Once in place and fully dry, the decals were sealed in another coat of that gloss varnish, and this will help protect them against any damage during the weathering steps that would soon follow. And whilst I'm on the numbering on the turret of this model, the 002, I received some information through my Facebook page suggesting the numbers of these command tanks should be either 91, 92 or 93. So for those of you who are inclined, I suggest you do your research because I'm not too sure where the 002 came from. And if anyone in this community has any reference for that, I would love to see the images. If the pigments were messy, the muddy terrains paste I made for the tracks was downright disgusting, but the acrylic paste will give me a greater volume to the mix, and when it dries, it will dry like a rock. So I chose the paste at this stage over the pigment mix for that reason. I made a mix of the acrylic textured paste with soil and debris and static grass fibers to bulk it up. Often these tracks would get clogged up with mud and filth, and I wanted to depict that on my model in some way. I began by smearing the paste over the tracks using an old brush, but soon gave up and used the tip of my finger to press it all in place. Because the paste is an acrylic, it is water-based, so by wetting my finger, I'm able to extend the drying time a little bit and work the paste in through those shapes. Once the tracks had an evenly uneven coverage through the recesses in the parts, I then applied some of that paste over the wheel sections. Mud would often build up through those areas also, so the paste will help replicate that and add some texture to those areas. A small amount of the paste was left over, so some of that textured muck was applied through the underside of the model to help bulk that area up. The paste takes around 24 hours to fully dry, so they were left off overnight. To me, a buff was then applied in a mottled and random way to lighten the finish, and that would help present a dusted look to those sections. The high points of those tracks were then brush painted using a colour called steel from Ammo. The silver will tone down during subsequent weathering, but should add that detail to the edges of the tracks, presenting in a polished way, although this was a section I'd have to readdress in later steps. This was just the foundation layer while I had access to the assembly. Dark Mud and Dry Step are pigment-dense enamel paints from Ammo and are used to create speckling and splattering effects around your model. The product is loaded onto a soft brush, and by flicking across a toothpick, I can create speckling over the model. I first applied the lighter colour and then the dark. The speckling should help add variation in the assembly, and the pigment content in the paint should add some volume also. The tracks were then set aside to dry. G'day guys, it's giveaway time again, and to celebrate this Tiger build series, I have a mid-production Takom Tiger to give away. All you have to do is make sure you like the video and you are subscribed, and comment below, and somewhere in the comments I'd like to see Wicked Tiger.
Wicked Tiger.
Make sure you're entered in. The prize will be drawn at the end of May. Good luck, and thanks again for all your support of this channel.
Let's go, get it back online.
Chipping is a technique that can be used to greatly enhance your model, but it is a technique that is often overused. So with that in mind, an ammo color called chipping is applied selectively over the model using a sponge. Most of the paint is removed from that sponge before starting the application. This allows only a small amount of that paint to transfer to the surface of the model. I'm working on areas that logically would see the most wear, such as the leading edges of mud flaps and grab handles, and the edges and corners of that stowage bin. It's important to ensure the chipping doesn't find its way onto those Zimmerit sections because, as you would recall from the previous video, those colour chips wouldn't be appropriate for those positions. By adjusting the amount of paint on the sponge as well as the pressure I'm applying, I'm able to create varied and in-scale chips quickly and easily. I'd been thinking of ways to dial the vibrancy of the model down and settled on a dot rendering style of filter. By applying small dots of dust, white and a few touches of umber oil paint, I am then able to blend them across the surface, creating a thinned layer filter over the top of that paintwork, and that gives me that appearance of a chalky faded style of paint. I'm blending the paint using a flat brush and white spirit, and I think you'll agree it really took the heat out of that scheme, which is exactly what I was looking for. The filter was focused over the sides and the lower edges, however the effect was applied over the horizontal surfaces of the turret, but in a more refined way to ensure the paintwork looked cohesive. The finished look tends to appear as the oils evaporate over time. If the look is too pronounced, I'm able to refine the coverage of that layer by softening it using a makeup sponge. The effect is subtle, but has had the desired effect and has set my base layer nicely. In hindsight, I should have painted the exhausts off the model. Creating authentic looking effects in this area is quite easy using sponging techniques. In saying that, the exhausts on this late Tiger are obscured by those heat shrouds, so I dressed that area by sponge chipping various tones of brown as well as a touch of dark yellow. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but post shading is easily one of my most enjoyable stages in the modelling process. A heavily thin mix of red, brown and black is used to reinforce recessed areas and create tonal variation over the paintwork. The other effect the red, brown and black has is it gives the model an overall tired and dirty tone that works perfectly on armour subjects. Because there was so much visually going on over the model, the shading helps re-establish the volume in those shapes and bring some character back to the model. The shading is continued around the shapes of the turret, focusing on the cupola as well as the panel lines and corners of the shapes. Weathering armour, for me at least, is a constant back and forth of finding balance in the depth of the finish, so slightly exaggerating each stage is a purposeful thing because I know the steps that will follow can often balance things out. A basic dusted layer is now applied using a thinned mix of Tamiya buff. By keeping the paint thin, it will ensure the paint is quite transparent, which means it won't completely cover over the paintwork underneath it, but should enhance it and give it the overall soft, dusty look to the finish. I'd applied this dusting to the wheel sections earlier, so it was now a case of repeating the process to ensure the continuity in this finish. My application is heavier around the lower shapes and gradually decreases as I move up the sides of the tank, with the turret receiving less coverage than the hull. And then, just like I did with the tracks in the earlier stages, I speckled the dry step and dark mud around the lower edges of the hull. The result is affected by how thin the paint is. Thinning it more will tend to make the specks harder to see because they are so diluted, so it's important not to thin the paint too much. In saying that, the paint can be harder to get a result from if it's too thick. I'm applying the specks in logical areas and being purposeful with my application. As much as I'd been fighting the urge, I couldn't help myself but to add a brown pin wash. I say I was fighting it because adding a brown wash can deepen the whole tone of the model, which is something I didn't want. However, that wavy, unique scheme tended to steal the shapes from the model, and the wash is another technique to help reinforce those shapes. With the initial stages of weathering of that hull complete, I could now attach the tracks and apply an all-over matte varnish to seal in the work I'd done to this point. If you recall from the build video, I added masks to the periscopes, so they could now all be removed with the bulk of the painting done. The rack of spare track links, as well as the tracks around the turret, needed some variation, and that was as simple as using light rust and orange rust acrylic paints. And just like when I painted the tarp, by keeping the paint wet, I'm able to create mottled tones and variation in those parts, giving each track link a unique individual look. Then by using the speckling technique over the part as a final step, I'm able to unify the parts and create an interesting visual representation of those spare tracks. I can also use that diluted mix over the tow cables to create some tonal variation in those areas. In reality, tanks in particular were subject to all types of weathering in the field and would often be covered in dirt and debris and organic material from the battlefield. Seagrass clippings as well as soil were scattered over the horizontal surfaces, with their placement fine-tuned using a soft brush. A light misting of hairspray was all that was required to hold them in place. One of the things that drew me to this kit was the stowage options that came with it, so I wanted to use some of it, but fact of the matter is the Tiger didn't carry a great deal of stowage as a general rule, kind of like the Rockstar not carrying their own suitcases.
Like Spinal Tap pre-Janine.
Laying a bed for the stowage helps it settle onto the model, so a tarp was sculpted using green stuff putty. The putty can be sticky, so talcum powder was used to negate that, and the putty was rolled into a sheet and trimmed to size. I could then lay the tarp down and use the brush moistened with tap water to sculpt and position it on the back of the engine deck. By lightly pressing the moulded stowage into the putty tarp, I can create a sense of weight and belonging to those pieces. I choose not to use the unditching beam as I alluded to earlier because due to the scheme and the plans I had for the next step, I felt it was an unnecessary distraction on the model. German tank crews would often use local foliage to camouflage their tanks. Using the picture of tank 211 as inspiration, although that's not the tank I'm actually building, I set about adding this detail to the model. I first began using a product from Model Scene that is more or less sea foam branches treated with a flock to create tree-like structures. The branches are poked under cables and logical pinch points and set in place with a touch of superglue. AK beech foliage was then used to bulk up the sections and create variation in the look of that foliage. The fine leaves on that product worked beautifully and presented quite authentically across the sides of the model. It's important not to be too structured with the placement, so constant reassessment was required, and once happy, again a touch of superglue was used to hold everything in place. The command version of the Tiger has 3 aerials to fit, with one of them including the star structure as a piece of etch. The aerials themselves are moulded styrene, which were difficult to clean given their fragile nature, and I'm not entirely sold on the look of them. However, the proportions and heights seem to be reasonably accurate with the limited information I had, so I decided to use them. Final steps were some oil washes to the wheels to add some greasy contrast, and the leading edges of the tracks and the machine guns were polished using a gunmetal pigment powder, and the Tiger was ready for inspection. Most of you would be comfortable with German 3-tone camouflage schemes and would be comfortable attempting them, but this scheme was something completely different. Granted, we're talking about the same colours, but the coverage and the shapes really became a test for me as to the direction I was going to take with the weathering and finishing of this model. There was always a risk that a scheme like this can end up looking a little toy-like, so the shading and the subtle layering played an important part in the evolution of this model. When I began adding the foliage, I felt like I was obscuring all that hard work and the subtleties I'd extracted from the paintwork. But looking at it now, I think it enhances the model without distracting from that unique wavy scheme. It seems my feelings were echoed after I shared this with my Patreon community and receiving some encouraging feedback. And whilst on Patreon, please welcome my newest kangaroos, Grant Mabry, Tom Rea and Dean Laughlin. Your generous support helps me create this content on a regular basis, and of course thank you to my wombats. Be sure to join us on the Patreon page and join in with the community we are building there. There you'll get additional content as well as direct messaging, behind the scenes glimpses and early access to content when possible. My next video will be something a little left of center, so stay tuned for that one. It flies, but it doesn't have wings, and it has fins, but it doesn't swim. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. I'll see you again in a couple of weeks.
That's Tiger.
Hi, Tiger.